Notable Calvinists are known to argue that God's primary concern is not the welfare of man, but for himself and his own glory. In contrast to the claims of Calvinism related to God's ultimate desire for self-glorification, traditionalism, the view that I hold to, emphasizes God's concern for humanity over and above his concern for self-glorification. Now let me pause right there, because the gentleman who quoted me and wrote an article and put it on my Facebook page actually misquoted this. And he says traditionalism emphasizes God's concern over and against his concern for self-glorification. Notice what he did there? Instead of over and above his concern for self-glorification, he changed it to over and against his concern for self-glorification, which is obviously a misquote. And it's a misquote that actually puts one against the other. In other words, it sets up the false dichotomy that either God is concerned for humanity or he's concerned for making his glory known. He's one or the other. He can't be both. Whereas what I'm saying is that his concern for humanity over and above his own self-glorification is what makes him so abundantly glorious. You see the difference? In other words, I'm not trying to set up either or. I'm saying that God is both and. God is both concerned for humanity, which exalts his glory because he's a self-serving, because he's self-serving, because he's other-oriented, as Tim Keller quotes later in this actual article, is that his other-orientedness, his other-centeredness, his willingness to give of himself makes him so abundantly glorious. And so we're not trying to set up the false dichotomy that the article that was trying to quote me, well, actually misquoted me. And I would have to think that's purposeful. I mean, it's there in black and white. You can read it for yourself. I don't say over and against his concern for self-glorification. I say over and above, because that's what reveals him as to being most glorious. Back when I was in college, I was very drawn to the Calvinistic teaching about God's desire for his own glory. This was especially attractive coming out of the more seeker-sensitive movement that seemed to put way too much focus on pleasing man rather than glorifying God. And quite honestly, Calvinistic authors introduced me to many texts in Scripture which do clearly appear to support the understanding of God's desire for self-glorification. And I couldn't begin to understand how any Bible-believing Christian could deny such a truth. They would have to be, quote, man-centered. They would have to be selfish. They would have to be humanistic to do so, right? Regardless of what some of my Calvinistic friends may think, in my journey out of Calvinism, I did not abandon the truth that God does seek to reveal his own glory. Instead, I realized that God's glory is best revealed in his self-sacrificial love for all. I came to understand that God does not sacrifice creation for the sake of his own glory, but instead he sacrifices himself for the sake of his creation, which in turn reveals him as the most glorious of all. It is the selfless motive of Christ's sacrifice that brings him so much glory. To in any way undermine the selflessness of the divine motive actually undermines the very thing that makes his grace so glorious. By putting the welfare of man above his own self-exaltation, God reveals himself to be so much more glorious, abundantly glorious, than anything we could imagine. The Calvinist seems to think that God's glory is best manifest by putting his own exaltation first, whereas the example of Christ reveals just the opposite. It is through giving up his glory, by putting the needs of lowly, undeserving humans first, that he is most abundantly glorified. Now, let me just stop right here and point a few things out. One, God doesn't need more glory. He is infinitely glorious. Okay, so God's not out there like I think the black hole of self is one author, Austin Fisher, put it, or the me monster in the sky, as another person put it. And again, I don't even think a lot of mainstream Calvinists would describe God in that manner either. So I'm not trying to put this onto mainstream Calvinists. I'm simply saying that some can take the teachings of Calvinism to their logical ends and take them too far, as to see God as just this kind of narcissistic me monster in the sky, kind of black hole of self that I just need, I want. And I somehow has to feed that glory hog, kind of like I have to have all this glory for myself, and I just need more of it. That in and of itself is an extreme and probably a hyperbolic misrepresentation of what Calvinists have strived to entertain and to teach with regard to the glory of God. But at the same time, I think it's the natural tendency that one begins to roll into when they start to strive to to maintain this understanding of sola de gloria as being something like God seeking more glory, as if there could be more glory than what he already has infinitely in his nature. He is infinitely glorious. So we have to understand that God's not seeking to get more glory, okay? He already has it all, okay? He's not seeking to get more glory. If anything, what God's doing is to make his self known because he's glorious. He's infinitely glorious already, okay? He's already infinitely glorious. He's not trying to make himself more glorious. He already is glorious, infinitely so. He's helping us to see who he really is. And who is he really? A loving God who mercifully gives up himself for the sake of helpless people? Or a controlling God who sacrifices helpless people in order to make himself look stronger and bigger? Do you see the difference? Because that's ultimately what it gets down to. And I know Calvinists are not going to like this analogy, and I apologize in advance for the harshness of it. But at the same time, sometimes we need these kinds of analogies to kind of shock us out of our worldviews and to help us to reconsider what we may be thinking and saying about God. You've got two individuals who are very well known in our world, Charles Manson and Mother Teresa, okay? Again, I know both of them have their faults and both of them have their issues. Both of them are sinful and all those kinds of things, okay? I'm not endorsing Catholicism. I'm using Mother Teresa, okay? I'm using a person who is an example of someone who selflessly gave to those who were helpless, not trying to make a name for herself, but yet a name was made for herself. She wasn't seeking her own fame, yet she got it. How? By seeking to help others, give herself up for the orphans in Calcutta. Okay, so she selflessly gave, not seeking her own exaltation or making herself known to anybody. She sought to help the helpless, and in doing so, she made a name for herself. She wasn't seeking a name for herself. That wasn't her motivation. Her motivation was love for these helpless, presumably. Okay, she loved helpless people. She gave herself up for helpless people, and in doing so, made her name known. Charles Manson, on the other hand, according to testimonies, and there's other, criminals like him. Charles Manson's just the one that came to my mind, or Jeffrey Dahmer, or somebody like that. These horribly bad people who wanted to make a name for themselves. They actually wanted to make a name for themselves, and they did so by hurting helpless people. In other words, to the sacrifice of helpless people, people who had no ability to help themselves. He overpowered them with his strength, and showed his power over them in order to demonstrate his strength and his power and his whatever, horrible thing he wants to demonstrate about himself. And he became a household name. So both Mother Teresa and Charles Manson are household names, but for two very different reasons. One of them seeking to demonstrate his power over helpless people in order to make his name known. The other seeking to help helpless people out of a love for them, not desiring to make their name known, but in turn still making their name known and making their name known for something that's actually good. Now, I know that analogy falls short. I know that Calvinists are going to hate that analogy. But the reason I make the dichotomy of those two analogies is to say that there is a distinction between the way in which a person's made known. The glory of a person is their fame. It's their renown. It's the reason you want to brag about them. And you don't want to undermine that reason by changing the motive that's driving their actions. And so if I change the motive that drove Mother Teresa's actions, and we actually found out that she wrote in her diary, hey, I'm going to these people of Calcutta, and yeah, I care about them and all, but my real motive here is that I want my name to be a household name in the world. I really want my name to be known. And that's the reason I'm actually going to Calcutta and helping these children. That's the ultimate reason. Now, there's a love for them too. I mean, I care about them and everything, but I'm ultimately doing this because I want them and everybody who hears about me doing this for them. I want them to glorify me. And again, all human analogies fall short. I recognize that. But I'm trying to show the dichotomy between what glory truly is and that we want to glorify God for his actual motivation. And is his actual motivation to make himself more glorious as if he can get more glory than he already has? Or could it be that his actual motivation is love? that he demonstrates his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, that nobody, there's no greater love than this, than one who gives up their life for their friends. That the motive, that his love, that for God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that the true motive here, that's what's driving him here, is not a desire for more glory, but a desire to love others. That's his actual motivation. And in loving others, undeserving others, by the way, which Paul is going to horribly misrepresent me, as you'll hear in this aspects. But these are people who are undeserving, enemies of God, who are wretches, who deserve condemnation, and yet he loves them anyway. That's what makes him so abundantly glorious. He's not loving awesome people. He's loving sinful people. And that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He loved us. He demonstrates his love for us, that while we were sinful, while we were horribly bad people, he did these things for us.